Welcome to the Same Day Podcast, where we discuss driving incremental business growth and other topics related to real estate, property management, and entrepreneurship. Now to the show at hand.
Matt Zalk here. I'm the host of the Same Day Podcast, where I connect with top business experts and real estate leaders. Past guests include Brian Elliott, talking about economic development in the Blue Dome and Arts District in Tulsa, Vondell Burns of the Thankless Productions, a virtual accelerator for current and aspiring creative entrepreneurs, and Sean Prince, investor and tech entrepreneur, discussing his experience starting and scaling a business. Today's episode is brought to you by Chris Lyle State Farm. Chris Lyle State Farm helps you protect your most precious assets and investments, whether it's your home and auto, investment rental properties, or other valuables. Call Chris Lyle State Farm for a quick and painless phone call to potentially save you double digits on all of your insurance needs. Visit diallyle.com or call his office at 918-878-7771. Today's episode is also brought to you by Keyrenter Property Management. At Keyrenter Property Management, we are a full-service property management business, helping our clients buy, renovate, and operate real estate assets. We help our clients build wealth while taking the headache out of property management. Jeff, you may agree that relationships are one of the keys to life. Imagine it's Christmas Eve and the heat goes out at a rental property. There probably isn't any worse situation or time for that maintenance issue to arrive, but it's important to have the relationships that allow you as a property manager or a property owner to get someone out there ASAP to solve the issue. It's not easy, but it's how we've built our business and our reputation through reliable, trustworthy, and responsive vendors like your friend Will Gilbrecht over at Franklin Heating and Air in Northwest Arkansas, who's an amazing guy. But that's why no matter what rental you have, single family homes, condos, townhomes, and apartments, we have the management solutions that you need so we can handle all that nasty stuff and you can enjoy your vacation. Go to KeyrenterPMC.com or info@KeyrenterPMC.com or email info@KeyrenterPMC.com for more information. A big shout out to Will, who I just mentioned with Franklin Heating and Air, who connected Jeff and I recently. They're one of the fastest growing HVAC businesses in the U.S. I also want to say thanks to Mike Bosch of Atento Capital and 412 Angels, who's been on the pod before and recommended that we speak. I'm grateful to Mike and all of his support and everything he's doing for the venture community and the startup community in both Tulsa and Northwest Arkansas. All right, Jeff. Jeff's a 9-time serial tech entrepreneur, runs a venture fund called Adjunct Capital Partners, and an entrepreneurial support organization called Startup Junkie Consulting. Jeff Amerine is also a best-selling author with his business partner, Jeff Stambridge. Their book, Creating Startup Junkies, Building Sustainable Venture Ecosystems in Unexpected Places, came out in 2021. Jeff was an adjunct professor at the University of Arkansas for many years. He's also a family man, married to Phil Amerine, and has 4 kids, including a son and 3 daughters. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
I love it. I've got 3 daughters. Let's talk about that for a second. I want to hear all your experience on raising kids.
I still have hair. I still have some hair left.
Impressive. That is impressive. All of his kids have contributed, and his wife have contributed to Startup Junkie Consulting. And I also want to hear about some of the lessons of operating a family business that runs at full speed. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Yeah, glad to be on. Thanks so much for having me on today, man.
I appreciate you being here. Let's talk for a second before we get started on the real topic. Tell me a little bit of experience about raising 3 girls. I've got twin girls and a baby. Mine are 3.5 years old and 21 months. And I'm hoping that my wife will let us have another kid and maybe try for a boy. Any experience you want to share before we get started?
Yeah. Well, with girls, you've got to be, my experience is you've got to be very empathetic, right? It's, there's a high degree of different emotions that girls have versus boys. And some of the rough and tumble things you can do with boys when they get into trouble or when they have issues, you got to take a completely different tactic with girls.
Right.
And it's been great. I've got 2 of the 3 are married, so I've made it through that milestone.
Nice.
And the other is doing some fantastic things in her career as well. And so I think the thing is just be empathetic and realize that we really are from a different planet, and listen to what your wife says when they're giving you signals you don't fully understand.
At 3.5 and 21 months now, my girls, they're still in that baby. They're so cute. And there's nothing that softens a man's heart. I was never particularly empathetic 100%. Or emotional, and just having 3 girls is an amazing experience in life.
It's been great. No doubt.
Kids are definitely the best. There's a ton of airtime with you online, and you're a strong voice for entrepreneurship and startups in Arkansas. Your podcast, which is amazing, Startup Junkie Podcast, has 328 episodes as of today, February 13th, is awesome. recommend everybody check it out. We've also got text interviews and their presence on other podcasts. So I want to avoid covering too much content that you've already covered. I wanted to talk to you about some of the lessons that you've extracted, certainly since 2001 when you moved back from the East Coast to Arkansas, but also in your 7 startups that were prior to that. Let's talk. I mean, you've seen a number of those startups. You've worked with a bunch. You've funded a bunch. Let's start for a moment where we were kind of before the podcast, which is there are 2 types of entrepreneurs. There are 2 types of companies. There are a bunch of companies that are startups, that are bootstrapped lifestyle businesses, and then there's the scalable, fundable venture. What's the difference in the type of entrepreneur that you see starting each kind of business?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's kind of a continuum there, right? It's not like it's necessarily completely black and white. There are lifestyle small businesses that maybe can make a decent living for you, create a job for you. There are highly scalable ventures where you have to get on that venture capital treadmill and raise a bunch of money. And then there's middle ground of where you can be growth oriented and somewhere in between. Maybe you raise some friends and family money. Maybe you use some bank debt. I would say the one common attribute for all of those people, because there really are easier ways to make a living, is the grit and the tenacity to stay with something. Because it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. When you have your own thing, when you have to create a team, when you have to convince customers to buy from a brand they've never heard of, that's tough. That's a gut check. And it's, in either case, it's long hours and low wages for a long time, or sometimes long hours and no wages for a long time. So I think grit and tenacity are the big things. Now, if you want to jump on that treadmill, that venture scale, the difference between that and kind of being in a small business where you're accountable to your employees and your customers is, in that case, you're going to have a partner that's going to have a lot to say about what you do. Venture capital firms are going to put you on their game plan. Even if you still have a majority controlling interest, they're going to have lots of limits of authority and lots of controls. They're likely going to be on your board. And so it requires a type of resiliency to be ready to take this thing that was probably your baby and give someone else some pretty significant say in what happens next. So having the ability to have really aligned objectives and some resiliency when in a venture capital backed business is an essential component. You got to be ready for that.
Have you seen experiences where the board wants to take the company in a different direction and the founder says no and the board is ultimately wrong?
Yes. Yeah, I've seen that. I've also, and a lot of times that will result in the founder getting invited to their next career, right? I mean, and sometimes that's a good thing, right? Sometimes it's a good thing because sometimes founders who are also operators, they tend to forget that they got to do what's in the interest of the shareholders, which includes your venture capital and yourself. But as an operator and as maybe a founder, you're too close to it, and it's hard for you to kind of separate those roles. So yeah, there have been plenty of instances where the venture capital firms who are trying to optimize return for their limited partners, their investors, will take a company in a direction that ultimately might not have been ideal. So it's super important to have that kind of stuff figured out and worked out and reconciled before you ever really get into bed with them.
Yeah,
they're not infallible. They do make mistakes as well.
I mean, I guess as a founder, you'd say, I got us to this point. It was my gut and intuition that told us where to go. I'm the visionary for this business. And I could see there being a very strong pull to stick to your guns when in the case that the board is saying you need to go a different direction or something. And that could be a real challenge.
Yeah. And the best situations I've seen are instances where the founder will listen to inputs from multiple sources, their board, the VCs, maybe a board of advisors, other mentors. They'll synthesize what they believe truth to be and then feed that back to the board to say, listen, this is why I have strong conviction that we need to go this direction. It's not just emotion. It's not just me. It's all these facts.
Right.
Now, at that point, they get voted down or whatever. They did everything they could do to head the right direction. They may decide to leave, go do something else. They may decide that maybe they can't sit in the CEO role. Maybe they need to be a chief creative or a chief product officer. Someone else needs it. But all those are possibilities. But synthesizing multiple different inputs and then having a good hand when you go into that kind of board meeting is really important.
So I worked at McKinsey and Company, the consulting firm, at the start of my career many years ago. And one of the services that we would often provide was the data that would support a decision that the CEO wanted to make in a startup environment where you're, potentially bootstrapped. You don't have a ton of cash. You certainly can't pay $1 million a month to McKinsey. How does a CEO go about kind of collecting or collaborating or collating all the information, the data that they need to support a strong argument that they would make to the board or to their venture-backed partners or to their venture partners, to go in that direction?
Yeah, it's a good question. And really, you only ever have about 70% of the data that you need.
Yeah.
Anytime you make, if you wait until you have perfect information, you're probably going to have lost an opportunity.
Yeah.
So given that you're dealing with imperfect information, you've got to tap all the sources that you have. I mean, good understanding of your customer, good understanding of the competitive landscape, a good group of informal advisors and mentors that have some inputs, and being able to quickly tap them for advice and guidance. That's kind of the key way, because you really can't afford to pay $400 or $500 an hour for McKinsey to go do an assessment. You've got to kind of deal with the issues based on your own knowledge and capability and your own informal advisors that you call on.
Yeah. Can you think of a good example in the Northwest Arkansas landscape where and maybe we want to talk generalities instead of specifics if it's going to embarrass somebody, but where the CEO, the founder of a company said, I want to go this direction. The venture backers said, I want to go this direction. And ultimately the CEO went that direction, and it was successful against his own or her own better judgment.
Yeah. So I guess a couple of instances where that had happened. I'll give you one in particular. There was it was a data analytics company, and they were at a point where they either needed to do a large Series A raise, Series B at that point, or they could be acquired. And their concern was, and I think this was something that was kicked around with the board, was that they couldn't make it on their own. They probably needed to be acquired at that point. And so it felt good. Everybody was excited about it. It was an acquisition by a West Coast venture that was a little farther along in terms of revenue growth. But the CEO, I think, in the beginning and through the whole process, had some apprehension about the directionality of the combined company. And that was manifest after in 3 changes in management team.
Wow.
A loss in revenues overall for the company, and what ended up being a fire sale. And it turns out this is a counterexample of where it looks good, it feels good, it seems like that's the right company to be acquired by. They're backed by some top tier West Coast firms, and they drove it into the ground.
Wow.
So that's an example where I think if the founder had stuck to his guns, maybe stayed the course for a Series B and kept going, they would end up with a better result. So, I mean, that's just one example, and it happens, right? Nobody's got perfect information at the time you have to make a decision. Could it have failed if they had stayed independent and done the raise, or would they have even gotten the raise given the circumstances?
Sure.
Who knows?
Yeah.
So you make the best judgments you can make at the time, and sometimes it doesn't pan out.
Yeah. You've talked about grit and hard work being important characteristics of entrepreneurs. Are there any other kind of threads that flow through some of the most impressive entrepreneurs that you've mentored or worked with?
Yeah, I would say the other common thread is they're mostly readers. They understand that 10,000 hour rule. They might not all be Mensa candidates, right? But they read, they talk to people, they become experts in their field. And so they're not going to lose by not having the level of expertise they need to be successful. The ones that are really successful are constantly students of their customer and of their competition and of the overall environment. And they always seem to be a step ahead of everybody else because they make it a point to be up on things. I think that's something else. Just being a voracious consumer of information that's relevant to your ability to be successful.
Isn't it amazing that you can take somebody's life experience and distill it, for $15, you can absorb all that in 200 pages or 300 pages. It's like, you don't even have to pay for it. You can go to the library and get it. It's amazing. Some people,
it's really true.
I ask some people on the podcast, what are you reading now? And they might say, I don't read that often. I think, well, we need to change that. What differentiates an entrepreneur looking to start a business in Northwest Arkansas versus one of the more traditional coastal startup towns? What brings them to the point where they're doing it in Northwest Arkansas?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that, because I saw an interesting tweet from somebody. It was one of the coastal guys recently that said, they said in New York, it's what you know. In LA, it's who you know. And in San Francisco, it was something else. And I said, and I tweeted back at that, and I said, well, in Northwest Arkansas, it's how can we help? The kind of response you get from the community in terms of success. So I would say, and this is true of Northwest Arkansas and Tulsa both, when you arrive here from somewhere else, it's not a lot of sharp elbows and abrasion and who are you? How'd you get my number? Go away, your competition. It's more of, God, we're glad you're here. This is a cool scene. Here's all the people you need to know. How can we get you in the mix? And it really doesn't matter where you're coming from. It can be from anywhere in the world or anywhere in the country. It's a very welcoming area. It's something that I think is largely in the DNA in the heartland of the US. It's definitely in the DNA in Northwest Arkansas and Tulsa. And so the experience you get when you get here is, it's maybe not as hard as it would be to start somewhere else. Now, I think we compensate with that support that we provide and that attitude against the things we don't have. I mean, there's not an infinite amount of capital here. There's not a 75-year history like you have in Silicon Valley. There's not necessarily a depth and breadth of all the technical talent you need. There are some things that we're still working on. But in terms of attitude and support, there's no place better. And so the people that come here, I think, are empowered and are moved forward and are left with a belief that it's possible here. They get that. Some of the infectious stuff that you'd see from George Kaiser or Sam Walton or Johnny Bryant Hunt or the original John Tyson, all of those families, even though that history was from quite a while ago, there's something they left in the DNA that said, even in these hard scrabble places, it's possible to build something that's outsized, something that can be globally consequential. And I think that matters a lot. That coalition of the willing around a common belief that it's possible.
You alluded to it briefly when you said there's maybe a dearth of technical talent. Along with that challenge, what are some other of the greatest challenges that you've seen working with startups?
I think that's one of the big ones, because everything is digital today. It doesn't matter what kind of business you're in. At some point or another, you're going to be relying on digital talent, and you can't import them successfully. Our immigration system is tough. You can't grow them fast enough necessarily if you don't have a real concentrated effort from your colleges, your universities, your community colleges, your tactical programs. The other challenges are, funding is always a challenge, but the one thing I would say there is, I guarantee you can go to Boston or Silicon Valley or New York and talk to the founders there, and they'd be like, I'm having a devil of a time raising capital.
Sure.
It's tough raising capital. If you have the right concept, you're solving a meaningful problem, and you assemble the right team, the capital will find you if you have to raise capital to do what you do. I would say the thing that we face very specifically here is we haven't had enough exits for venture scale companies for there to be this constant reinforcement of the belief that, hey, they did it, I could do it too. Now we're getting there, but it's a very episodic thing, right? I mean, these things can be spaced 6 months, a year, a couple of years. We have to have a density of positive outcomes, because that re-energizes this sort of virtuous cycle of getting those people to reinvest in the people that are coming behind them. We're getting there, but that's also a challenge. We need more exits, and then more renewal and reinvestment from those seasoned entrepreneurs.
As the tide has shifted towards the heartland, towards Northwest Arkansas, in terms of the rise of entrepreneurship, is there something in excess of the kind of welcome attitude where people don't view you directly as competition, that has, just that general spirit of welcoming and that spirit of mutual success and people wanting you to be your best, that's really contributed to the rise of entrepreneurship in Arkansas?
Well, I would say a couple of other things. One is your dollar goes farther here. So if you're looking to hire talent or even mediocre talent, and you're on the coast, you're going to pay a ridiculous amount of money for average people. Here, if you're willing to pay a nationally competitive wage for almost any kind of professional position, or if you've got a good stock option, a compensation plan, you can get really great people for a reasonable amount still. And this, as this becomes a more popular area, some of that's getting bid up because the real estate's getting more expensive. But that's one advantage. Your burn rate will be lower, your runway will be longer. It gives you the ability to get into some things at a lower initial entry to barrier, less capital to get going. Valuations from the investor side can be a little more reasonable here in the heartland. Those are all things that I think are additional attributes. And beyond that, there has been a pretty well-developed system of entrepreneurial support organizations, angel groups, programs, accelerators. It's a 75-year journey. If you look at Silicon Valley, from where they were in 1945 or so to where we are now, almost 80 years, we're 15 years or so into this in a real consequential way. So you got to also kind of say, when you're in this kind of area, it's going to be a long march. Stand by. It's a multi-generational thing. And you just get a little bit better every day in all aspects as an ecosystem.
Where does that push come from to be that helpful culture of Northwest Arkansas's business community? What's the origin story there?
So I mean, you could get really philosophical, and this is the world according to Jeff. And people are really historically savvy might debate this, but I kind of look at it like this: we're in this place called the Ozark Plateau. There was never arable land here. There was never really plantations here. There was never a concentration of wealth that came from all the things that the Old South did. There never was. We were more like Appalachia in that regard. And so people had to figure out a way to make a living. There was a scrappy, gritty entrepreneurial DNA because nothing came easy here.
Right.
There was no multi-generational wealth here at all because it was a hard place to make a living. So when you see people like Johnny Bryant Hunt, the founder of J.B. Hunt, who had a 6th grade education, was dyslexic, build the largest transportation company, long-haul transportation company in the country, you ask yourself, well, how was he able to get that done? He was able to get that done because he had the power of belief and hard work, and people could see that, and he was willing to take a risk. Largely the same kind of story with Sam Walton, the guy who just kind of started looking at the Ben Franklin 5 and dime, realized he could do something bigger, realized he could build a great culture. And so I think part of it is that hard scrabble background that this area has led people to see some outside stuff was built here. If they could do it, we could do it too. And as part of that, you've had these entrepreneurial support organizations that have come about through federal funding, through state funding, through the Walton Family Foundation funding, and others. And it's been a coalescing around, geez, if we're going to make this a diverse economy that's not reliant on just one or a couple of big industries, we've got to start from the ground up. The traditional economic development model says, well, we're going to go find a factory. We're going to go move people in here. And that's important. But that's like saying, I'm going to change my outcomes by going to buy a winning lottery ticket. Versus if you work on economic empowerment of startups and small businesses through the skills and the activities and the engagement and all the community related stuff, that's something that sticks and it's long term. So, I mean, that's the other aspect of it that I think there's a lot of good programmatic and support stuff that was absent 15, 20 years ago that's here now.
Has real estate's recent appreciation in Fayetteville and in Bentonville, I mean, hugely in Bentonville and in other areas in Northwest Arkansas, had any detrimental impact on the entrepreneurial ecosystem, or is that just kind of a by story?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good question. It's something that I think the tale is yet to be completely told on that. It has been bid up because as people who are selling properties are moving in from the coast, either to be remote workers or whatever, they've got lots of money that they can spend on real estate that seems cheap, but that's bidding up the cost locally. So if you started here locally, you might find as it relates to residential real estate, it's tough to find a place to live. And so what's being worked on is affordable housing, affordable housing that's still in really nice areas, walkability and all that stuff in city centers in Fayetteville or in Springdale, Rogers or in Bentonville. And that'll make a big difference because you want people to graduate from the colleges that are here locally and feel like they can stay and afford to stay and not just get a job, to be an employee at one of the large enterprises, but to actually start something. So I think that's something we got to constantly keep an eye on, or else we're going to have pockets of people that have to move 15 or 20 miles away and live in, Prairie Grove or Farmington or Gentry or some of the outlying areas just because they can't afford to live near the hubs.
I was just pulling up an article here. The New Yorker wrote an article called "The Astonishing Transformation of Austin" recently, and it's long form. It's a probably 40-minute read or something, an hour-long read. But it talks a lot about that the influx of people from the coast driving prices up means that the people that service everything in a community can no longer live in that community. It's happened in San Francisco. It happens in mountain communities in Colorado, like Vail and Aspen. But it certainly removes part of the original charm of a town. It also removes that kind of the free-spirited culture of the people that were there that were just in lower wage, lower income jobs. And a lot of it in Austin they talk about is the music scene, that people are moving, the original musicians that were making a living strumming a guitar or playing the French horn at a local music hall can no longer do that. And they're moving out and doing art somewhere else, which is really a shame. I'd hate for that to be the case in the communities where we live, that, some of the fabric of our community is really built on those creative types. And yet, I'm in real estate and I see the price of real estate increasing all the time. And so I'm kind of stuck at the heart of this thing with some pain related to that.
Yeah.
What advice would you give somebody that wants to be an entrepreneur but hasn't found the confidence or the courage to make that leap?
Well, you're never too young to start and you're never too old to start. So a lot of times people say, well, I've got to do it by a certain date. Again, they believe the sort of hoodie wearing mythology that you see from the coast. And it turns out that the most successful entrepreneurs are middle-aged, 45 and up, really. And, as an old guy now, it makes me smile a little that time on earth actually matters, right?
Yeah.
It really does matter. But my advice is, you're ready when you're ready. But if you think you're 75% of the way being ready, go ahead and do it. Go ahead and do it. It's what I always felt like, and I know not everybody's wired this way, but I always felt like when I left a large enterprise and I worked at several of them and left, job security, if you will, to go do a startup, I always felt like, listen, if I was great at what I was doing in that large enterprise when I left, I'm going to be better after I learned something in the startup world, because it's a compression of everything. You have to do a bit of everything. You're going to learn more in less time. I'll be even more valuable if I have to go back. And so part of it is, it's not a one way. It's not a one-way door that you can't walk back through the other direction if it doesn't work out. I would say the other thing that's interesting is a whole lot different than what it was in the 90s. Is there's all kinds of people that want to see you succeed, not just here and not just in the heartland, but take advantage of the free programs, the accelerators, the incubators. Get schooled on all the available content that's out on YouTube and other video forums in terms of lean startup methodology and how to do this stuff efficiently. Start as a side hustle. The point is, do your research, get going, get started, and engage with other people that are trying to do it. It's not impossible. I think there's the famous Chinese saying that says the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. Right. And that's for real. Get started. We've dealt with 11-year-old entrepreneurs that actually went on Shark Tank and were successful. And we've got first-time entrepreneurs that are in their 60s that are building the businesses of their dreams after doing a bunch of other stuff first. So it's never too early. It's never too late. But if you've got that passion, just get going, get started.
What was the 11-year-old on Shark Tank for?
Yeah. So her name is Sophie Overton. And she was in the Young Entrepreneurs Academy that was run in Bentonville. And then she won 5 of our Idea Fame elevator pitch contests against adults. Wow. Very precocious, smart girl. Then she got an opportunity through a Bentonville Shark Tank tryout that we had, where the Shark Tank producers were here. She got picked up as one to actually go on the show, and was successful in getting an offer of investment from a couple of the sharks. And it was what the company did. It was socks, a socks company that had pockets. Wise Pocket Products is what it was called. So that was pretty cool.
I love that. I can just imagine. I'm going to watch the Shark Tank if I can find it online. But I can imagine an 11-year-old navigating, the investor, whatever happens on Shark Tank, where they actually pitch their
Yeah.
their investment, and you have to navigate between all that. That would be very funny.
She was
and very
really
impressive.
mature beyond her years, and she was a pretty good comedian too. I mean, she's going to do something big, whether it's ultimately that company or something else. She's one to watch.
I love it. How can Tulsa and Northwest Arkansas work more closely together to benefit both towns, both entrepreneurial communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's an hour and a half distance, and the good news is the people that can kind of make it rain in that regard: George Kaiser Foundation, Atento Capital, Walton Family Foundation, Heartland Forward, and Ross Duvall. They have seen that there's shared interest. There's a lot of value in having this sort of super regional view that plays the strengths of both areas. And one of the ways to think about it is, if you've got two constituencies in any venture ecosystem that are really the most important, it's the entrepreneurs that are coming up with great ideas and building the ventures, and it's the investors. And the investors, when you take a myopic view that you're really going to only be interested in stuff in one region or one state, your chance of alienating those investors, particularly early on, is high. They need to see more deal flow in the things that they understand from maybe across the country or across the larger region. And so if you take that kind of view, having bridges built to other locations like Tulsa, like Kansas City, like Little Rock, like St. Louis, it makes a lot of sense. Building bridges, particularly in the heartland, is important because we haven't been at it for 75 years. And so if you can also find overlapping areas like advanced mobility and supply chain, kind of leveraging some of the things that speak to the histories of these areas, and work on that together, only good things can come from that. So it's kind of remarkable to see the stuff that 412 Angels is doing, George Kaiser Foundation, and that Walton Family and all of us are doing over here locally. It's really it's impressive to see how that's all worked.
But so that's the small. I mean, that is the hour and a half away, and creating a bigger ecosystem so that venture investors have more of a pipeline of investment potential to look at. But you're also working with Seoul, South Korea, with Singapore. You're bringing in entrepreneurs from the other side of the world to do what exactly? What's the hope of for the outcome of that program? And can we do it with communities in Canada? Can we do it with Tel Aviv entrepreneurs? Can we do it broader?
Yeah, well, absolutely. As somebody once said to me, it matters a whole lot more of who you're with versus where you are.
Yeah.
And so if you think, there's some interesting pockets of innovation and entrepreneurship in places like Seoul, South Korea, and in Singapore, in Tel Aviv, throughout the EU, in different areas. If you can connect them to the assets you have in the way of the large enterprises like what we have in Northwest Arkansas, and show that, hey, there's some things in some of these areas that you all might not see as a large enterprise that can help your competitive advantage, it only strengthens both ecosystems. Right. A lot of times people who are not in the U.S. think their only landing point in the U.S. is going to be in California or in New York or Boston. Whereas when they realize you've got this really significant concentration of Fortune 500s in the heartland, and you can get direct access to them. I mean, you can go into a coffee shop and run into C-level or VP level folks. There's just a ton of people that are around here that are in supply chain and retail and food and beverage that you want to know. And so what we did with the Korea Testbed program, what we've done with some of the accelerator programs, is we tried to mine some of these other areas that not everybody else is thinking about. And we encouraged them to think about Northwest Arkansas as a place where their connections to the kind of customers they want is going to be better than anywhere else. If you try to establish the same kind of contacts in LA, you're lost in a sea of 40 million people.
Right.
Whereas here, there's 600,000 people in this whole area in Northwest Arkansas. And we, as sort of that intermediary, can get you to exactly the people that you want to know. So that's part of the reason why we started these bridge programs to other areas, even offshore places. And hopefully someday it'll go the other way as well.
Have you seen much success early on from the initial groups that you brought from Seoul and Singapore?
Yeah, we have. So as an example, there's a computer vision company that we started working with as part of the testbed program. It's called Deeping Source AI, and they do some really interesting things with computer vision that are extremely helpful. It ties into your CCTV cameras. It preserves privacy and anonymity, but they're able to provide really interesting information for a retailer or an airport on the way people are flowing, what they're doing, really kind of who they are without saying who specifically they are.
Interesting.
That one was good enough that we invited them to participate in the Fuel AI Accelerator, which is global recruiting. And they came here and were in residence for that whole 14 weeks and have ongoing opportunities with some of the large enterprises. That's just one of a bunch of examples we could talk about.
Love that. Are you seeing other startups, businesses in the AI space now that that's such a hot, I guess, topic fueled by ChatGPT and Google's new announcement that they're integrating their AI with their search functionality?
Yeah, that one's going to be red hot and you wonder, we were aware of it anyway, but now that ChatGPT and DALL-E and some of these other things, Jasper, are kind of very approachable, I think it has the chance to change everything, because the promise all along was you're going to have better actionable insights. You're going to be able to make better decisions. But it still kind of felt like, well, you got to be a trained data analyst or a data scientist to interpret this for the executives. Now it's like anybody that's got any kind of responsibility, whether they're a marketer, they're in sales, they can get in there and have content created. They could get in there and use these things essentially for research tools, far better, far more time saving than some of the other stuff that was out there. So yeah, I think that's going to continue to be a hot space. And like everything where it's pretty fragmented, there'll be some consolidation. There'll be some crazy stuff that happens where you're getting really erroneous information based on the biases of the people that are feeding the AI. But I think overall, it's going to be a game changer for industry in general.
I have yet to figure out how we can really leverage it as a tool in property management. There's a couple of very simple ways where we can create content for a listing, for a rental listing or something, but I have yet to figure out how we can really, really deeply embed it in something that is meaningful in our business. But I'm continuing to think about it, and I'm going to see where it goes. I watched a podcast recently with James Bell and the Bentonville Beacon that you spoke of where you spoke about the learnings from failure, the process of failure. And I was talking with a cousin recently at a family wedding who has the opportunity to start a canned alcoholic business with a few friends. And he's really afraid of how the potential for failure would impact his ability to raise capital for the development of multifamily real estate deals in the future, which is really his more serious passion. And I tried to explain to him that, the two businesses were separate. I tried to explain to him that the two businesses have different investor profiles, people that would be putting capital into them, different return expectations, different expectations for likelihood of failure. Like, I don't think multifamily greenfield development is as venture necessarily. It's really a more tried and true business, whereas a brand that you're building in canned alcoholic beverages is really more of a kind of a startup type business. But he's really, he's really not sure that he wants to go with the canned beverage for the risk that it would destroy his reputation and limit his ability to raise capital in the future. And that really he's afraid that would stymie his main career path. What do you say to somebody that's thinking of giving up their entrepreneurial dreams to stay with a more steady investment thesis?
Well, to the one hand is, and somebody told me this 20-something years ago, they said, think of everything you do in your life or your career as the creation of your own personal mutual fund. And so you're going to have some things that are rock solid that you're great at. You might want to try some things that are higher risk, higher reward.
Yeah.
And by doing that, you can kind of scratch the entrepreneurial itch on some of these things and not feel like you're risking everything. There was this sort of belief or this mythology that it was all or nothing. You had to be completely all in on just one thing in order to be successful. It's not necessarily the case anymore. I mean, you can figure out how to start something as a side hustle, and failure is something you don't want to get at. And at the enterprise, at the venture level, you want to try to avoid that if you can. It's not the end. You're not radioactive forever if you do fail. But what we talk about now is this idea of incrementally getting things to fail early. So fail fast and iterate. And how you do that is you just test the fire out of your concept, the unmet need, the problem that you want to do through lean startup methodology, through customer discovery, where you're taking lots of relatively inexpensive risk and tests so that ultimately you've got a good product market fit. you've got something where there's been enough demand validation that you've beaten a lot of the risk out of it before you spend the big money to actually go forward. So I think incrementalism, treating the bevy of things that you want to get involved in as a portfolio, segregating those risks by having, separate LLCs or separate legal entities with different investors and different people involved. And then also making sure that you don't get to the point that I've gotten a few times in my life where you're doing an unbelievably mediocre job at like 50 things. So you still need to be focused, but you can experiment with a couple of these things that might be passion projects or the next big thing. And you'll know when you know if you should go all in. But you can get a lot of the hard work that typically mitigates failure done without spending a lot of money on the front end. And then when you're ready to go, you go.
Excuse me. The model has changed in the past. It was at one time thought, you have to be all in and forget side hustle. And then Warby Parker came along and they were all doing it as grad students at Penn or wherever they were, at Wharton or whatever it was. So you think it's still possible, in other words, to be doing this as a side hustle, and investors will not look wholly disfavorably upon that side hustle? They won't say, well, you're not all in, fully committed with everything and all of your being, and therefore I won't back you.
Well, it's an interesting question, and it really depends on the stage. So when you're going through these discovery stages, which is where hopefully you can find, is there real demand? Can I create my product market fit? Perfectly fine if it's a side hustle, but that's typically coming out of your wallet or the triple F round, friends, family, and fools, people that are investing in you because it's you.
Yeah.
The more sophisticated the investors they get, the more demanding they're going to be, and the more they're going to require you to be solely focused on it. So when you think you're to the point where you're going to raise institutional or venture capital, you 100% will have to be all in.
Right.
Even angels who are not family members, you're probably going to have to be all in. Up to that point, when you're going through validation, you're trying to learn and you're trying to figure out what's this business model need to be. Perfectly fine and probably appropriate for that to be a side hustle.
Interesting. Nice distinction there. Who are some colleagues in the industry that you most respect in Northwest Arkansas, or really anywhere?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would say there's a few locally. There's one guy in particular that I'll call out because I've kind of seen his whole career path as it relates to what he's done in startup. There's a guy named Justin George who runs a company called Aptogee, which is an ed tech company that's raised a couple of rounds of capital. And he was a guy that was always good at business development, but 10 plus years ago, he started this concept for this ed tech company that was going to provide an all-in-one communications and marketing platform for school districts.
Interesting.
And I can remember in the early days of that, everybody was like, could you think of a worse vertical to sell into than school districts? They never have budget. It's going to be very bureaucratic. But he figured out how he could make a extremely compelling value proposition. And he realized that if you can sell into a difficult vertical like that, which not a lot of people can do, you're going to have an unbelievable barrier to entry. And so now they're in something like 3,500 school districts all across the country. They are the market leader in that space. They're doing so well in school districts that the cities are now coming to them with for requests for their stuff because they've seen the power of what it does. So why do I admire him? He built a really resilient culture. He focused a lot on the front end. A lot of times entrepreneurs are all about the mechanics. I've got to get the customer, I've got to get the talent, but they're not really thinking about what's really my number one asset. It's a team. He spent a ton of time on the front end saying, it's not just going to be marketing eyewash. We need to build a culture that informs who we hire, why we fire, what customers we go after, how we treat each other. And so I admire, he took a lot of the stuff you hear in textbooks or that as consultants we preach, and he internalized it in a really meaningful way. So Justin George would be one that I would hold in high esteem of Aptogee.
Why can other people not execute that same cultural development portion of their business? Why has he succeeded, whereas other people may have failed in building that?
It's hard. I mean, the people part of any game is ultimately where the failure comes from. you don't have the right people in the right seats. You don't have the people that can ask the hard questions. You don't have the people that say, gee, we're building something that nobody wants because the cult of personality of the founder is sending us down a direction that he thinks is right, even though it's clear that it isn't. So it's hard. Building a lasting culture requires constant attention and reinforcement. The other thing I'd say about culture is there's going to be a culture there, whether it's formally recognized and worked on or whether it's informal. And if it's informal, it's probably negative in some instances. And if it's negative, it's going to lead to churn. People are going to have the wrong motivations. It's just a good culture and good work on answering that why question and setting a good vision, having good core values. It is what leads to long-term success. So I think reason why people struggle with it is it feels like a soft skill. It feels like, oh yeah, I'll get to that when I get to it. And it's the most important thing. It really is.
It's so hard to build, and
it's tough to build, and it's tough to maintain. Requires a lot of attention.
Indeed. Jeff Amerine is a 9-time serial tech entrepreneur, runs a venture fund called Keyrenter Capital Partners. Are you guys raising a new fund, by the way?
We are. Yeah, we're in the throes of that right now.
Love it. Let's talk about how we can find out more about that. I'll run this. I want to ask you about that. He's an entrepreneur. Keyrenter Capital Partners, and he runs an entrepreneurial support organization called Startup Junkie Consulting, including the podcast that is eponymously named. Jeff's also a best-selling author with his business partner, Jeff Stambridge. Their book is called Creating Startup Junkies, Building Sustainable Venture Ecosystems in Unexpected Places. And that book came out in 2021. Jeff, where do people find you, and how can they learn more about investing a little bit in Keyrenter Capital Partners in that next fund if they want?
Sure. If you want to find out more about Keyrenter, you can see what we've invested in Fund 1, and we're raising Fund 2 as we speak. And that's at KeyrenterCapital.com. And it's Keyrenter is CADRON and then capital.com, Keyrenter Capital. If you want to find out more about me, you can look at startupjunkie.org. My profile's on there, or innovationjunkie.com, which is the other consulting practice that we run. So by all means, and I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter as well. If people want to follow any of the crazy stuff that I put out.
I love it. Jeff, thanks for being on the pod. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was good fun.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Same Day Podcast. Tune in to a new show each week and be sure to subscribe to get future episodes.